They called it Camp Shelby, out in the middle of God-forsaken Arizona, a sun-baked purgatory for Japanese prisoners of war. Me, I was Private Elijah Eli Vance, 19 years old, from a dusty farm in Mississippi, trading cotton fields for guard duty. This was 1944. Pearl Harbor was still a fresh wound, and hatred for the Japs ran as thick as molasses in July. My job was simple: keep 'em in, keep 'em quiet. But that day a new order came down, rattling through the mess hall like a loose floorboard. Feed 'em American, hamburgers, Coca-Cola. I thought it was a sick joke. These were the men who screamed "Banzai" and died for their emperor. They weren't supposed to eat our food, they were supposed to spit on it, but they didn't. They took the paper plates, hesitant, their eyes, usually hard and defiant, now wide with suspicion. I watched as the first one, a young private barely older than me, took a small, almost fearful bite of the burger. His eyes squeezed shut. Then a single tear tracked a clean path down his dirt-streaked face. And then another, and another. Soon, the whole damn mess hall was filled with the sound of men, hardened soldiers, sobbing like lost children. Not from pain, not from hunger, from a hamburger. And I, a black man in a uniform fighting for a freedom I didn't fully have, stood there watching my supposed enemies break down over a meal, and it shook me to my core. If you're ready to hear more stories from the forgotten corners of history, stories that challenge what you thought you knew about war and humanity, hit that like button and subscribe. Let's keep these voices from fading. My name is Elijah Vance. In 1944, I was serving in a segregated quartermaster unit, guarding Japanese POWs in a dusty camp in Arizona. The war in the Pacific was raging, a brutal no-quarter fight fueled by racial animosity. For me, a black soldier, the irony of my situation was a daily torment. I wore the uniform of a nation that treated me as less than a man, while I guarded men who were told they were less than human. The contradiction gnawed at me. A silent personal war fought in the shadow of a larger global conflict. Our camp was a stark place, miles from anywhere, ringed by barbed wire and patrolled by men like me. We were told these prisoners were fanatic, brainwashed, capable of anything. We treated them with suspicion, sometimes with open hostility, mirroring the hatred preached by our own propaganda. The common belief was that they'd rather die than surrender, and if they did, it was only to escape and fight again. The central conflict of this story wasn't on a battlefield, but in the mess hall of Camp Shelby. It was the clash between what I believed about the enemy and the stark human reality presented by a simple meal. We were given an order: introduce a group of newly arrived Japanese POWs to American food, specifically hamburgers and Coca-Cola. I expected defiance, maybe even disgust. What I witnessed instead was a profound, heartbreaking emotional collapse that left me utterly speechless. It wasn't just about the food, it was about the shattering of their world, and in turn, the unsettling shift in mine. The new shipment of prisoners arrived just after dawn, caked in the same red dust that covered everything in Arizona. They were a sorry sight, hollow-cheeked and gaunt, their uniforms hanging off them like rags. But their eyes were still hard. You learned to read men by their eyes in a place like this, and theirs were filled with a brittle, cornered animal defiance. These weren't the weary, resigned Germans we sometimes saw. These were men from Okinawa, from Saipan, men who had been told their whole lives that surrender was the ultimate shame, worse than death. And now, here they were, surrendered, alive, and surrounded by the Oni, the blue-eyed American devils they'd been warned about. I was on the processing line, patting them down, my hands rough over their thin tunics. My CO, Captain Miller, a white man from Alabama who always looked like he'd just sucked on a lemon, was barking orders. "Get 'em processed, Vance. Get 'em deloused. And for God's sake, don't turn your back on 'em." He didn't need to tell me. We'd all heard the stories. A guard at another camp got a sharpened spoon in the neck for getting careless. "Yes, sir," I muttered, pushing the next man along. It was a strange dance, me and these prisoners. I was the guard, the man with the rifle, but in the eyes of Captain Miller, I wasn't much better than them. He called me boy, and them Japs. We were two different kinds of less than existing in the same barbed wire world. The prisoners knew it too. Sometimes I'd catch them looking at me, a flicker of something in their eyes. Not respect, not fear, confusion. As if they couldn't figure out why a dark-skinned man was wearing the uniform of their white enemy. It was a question I asked myself every damn morning when I laced up my boots. After processing, they were shoved into their new barracks. For 2 days, they barely ate. We gave them standard rations: rice, some kind of vegetable gruel, bread. They ate just enough to keep from starving, eyeing the food with suspicion, as if expecting it to be poisoned. They spoke only to each other in low, guttural Japanese, their heads bent together. Then on the 3rd day, the order came down. Sergeant Willis, a fellow black NCO from Detroit, called me and my squad, James, a fast-talking kid from Chicago, and Preacher, who carried a worn-out Bible in his hip pocket, into the supply office. "Got a new one from command, boys," Willis said, chewing on an unlit cigar. "This is gonna sound peculiar." "Weird peculiar or stupid peculiar, Sarge?" James asked. "Both," Willis grunted. He tossed a memo onto the desk. "High Command, in their infinite wisdom, wants to run a cultural integration test. Seems they think a little American hospitality will make these new POWs more cooperative, make 'em see what they're fighting against." "Cooperative," I said. "Sir, these men would slit their own throats if they had the chance. What are we gonna do? Show 'em a Mickey Mouse cartoon?" "Worse," Willis said, his face deadpan. "We're gonna feed 'em. Tonight's menu in mess hall be hamburgers, fried potatoes, and Coca-Cola." We just stared at him. "Hamburgers, Sergeant?" Preacher asked, his brow furrowed. "Like, with meat, real American beef, straight from the quartermaster's freezer. The good stuff. The stuff we don't even get on Tuesdays," Willis said. "And Cokes, in the glass bottles. They're sending 2 crates over from the officers' club." I couldn't believe what I was hearing. "They're wasting beef on them. We've been eating canned hash for a week." "That's the order, Vance," Willis snapped. "They want a morale-building meal. They want to show 'em the abundance of the American way of life. And we," he said, pointing at us, "are gonna be the ones to serve it." "This is insane," James muttered. "They're gonna throw it right back in our faces. Wasting good food. Wasting our time." "My thoughts exactly," Willis said. "Which is why we're going in locked and loaded. Full kit, rifles, sidearms. No one takes their eyes off 'em for a second. We'll have 2 men on the door, me on the platform, and you 3 will serve the food. Go in, slap it on the trays. Get out. Clear?" "Clear, Sarge," we said. But it wasn't clear. It was murky as hell. Here we were, a squad of black soldiers ordered to serve a feast, a symbol of American prosperity, to our sworn enemies. A feast that we couldn't get, served by men who couldn't even sit at the same lunch counter as the white officers who gave the order. The irony was so thick you could cut it with a K-bar knife. That evening, the mess hall was thick with tension. The sodium lights hummed, casting a sick yellow glow. The prisoners, about 60 of them, were marched in. They sat stiff-backed at the long wooden tables, silent, their faces unreadable masks. They saw us in full gear, rifles slung, and their eyes hardened. They were expecting a beating or maybe just another humiliation. I was behind the line, a metal spatula in my hand. In front of me was a huge, steaming tray of hamburger patties. Next to me, James was scooping fries. "All right," Willis called out from the platform. "First table, move." The first group of prisoners got up, shuffled forward. They picked up their metal trays, their movements wooden. They slid them along the rail. When the first man reached me, he stopped. He looked at the hamburger patties, then at me. His eyes were dark, filled with mistrust. "Take it," I said, my voice flat. I scooped a patty onto his bun. He flinched, as if expecting me to hit him with the spatula. He didn't move. "Go," I barked. "Next." He shuffled to James, who dumped a pile of fries on his tray. Then he got to Preacher, who was standing next to the metal tub filled with ice and glass bottles of Coca-Cola. Preacher picked one up, opened it, and handed it to the prisoner. The man just stared at it. This little, fluted glass bottle. He looked at the red and white logo. He looked at Preacher, then at me. His expression was a mixture of absolute confusion and deep suspicion. He picked up the bottle, holding it like it was a live grenade. He didn't know what to do. "It's soda, man," James hissed. "You drink it. Sheesh." The prisoner slowly walked to his table and sat down. He didn't eat. He just stared at the plate. One by one, the rest of them filed through. Same reaction. They'd take the plate, take the bottle, and sit down, frozen. The entire hall was silent except for the clink of bottles and the clank of trays. Finally, they were all served. They sat there, 60 men, staring at 60 hamburgers. Not a single one had taken a bite. "What's the holdup?" James muttered. "Think it's poisoned?" "Probably," I said. "That's what their propaganda would tell them. That we're animals who torture our prisoners." Willis's voice boomed from the platform. "Eat! Tabaroo! Eat!" An older prisoner, a sergeant maybe, barked an order. Reluctantly, almost in unison, the men picked up their burgers. They held them strangely, with two hands examining them. The first man who'd come through the line, the young one, looked at his burger, then looked up, his eyes finding mine across the room. I held his gaze, my face hard. "Go on, eat it. See what your enemies are made of." He lowered his head, opened his mouth, and took a small, cautious bite. The young prisoner chewed slowly. His jaw muscles worked, but his eyes were locked on the table. He swallowed. It was a hard, pained swallow. Then he just froze. His shoulders began to tremble. It was subtle at first, just a slight tremor like a man trying to fight off the cold. But this was Arizona. It was 90 degrees in that mess hall, even at night. "What's wrong with him?" James whispered next to me. "He choking?" I shook my head. My eyes narrowed. "No. Look." A single tear dropped from his chin and hit the paper plate, making a small, dark spot next to the fries. He didn't move to wipe it. Then another. He squeezed his eyes shut and brought a fist to his mouth, but a sound escaped. A low, choked sob. It was the sound of a dam breaking. The other prisoners, who had been watching him, now looked at their own plates. One by one, hesitantly, they followed his lead. They took a bite, and the entire room broke. It wasn't loud, not at first. It was the sound of 60 men trying, and failing, to cry silently. Men who had been trained from birth that showing emotion was a weakness, that crying was a disgrace. Men who had probably seen their friends blown to bits without shedding a tear. And here they were, in a U.S. Army mess hall, completely undone by a piece of grilled meat and a bun. The sobs grew louder. Men were bowing their heads, their shoulders shaking violently. Some covered their faces. One man in the back just let his head fall forward and thud onto the table, his wails muffled by the wood. "What the hell is this?" James said, his hand instinctively going to the grip of his sidearm. "Is it a trick? They poisoned?" "Shut up, James," Preacher hissed, his knuckles white on his own rifle. "Look at him. That ain't a trick. That's broken." Sergeant Willis, up on the platform, was just as stunned as we were. He'd seen combat in Italy, seen men die. I don't think he'd ever seen anything like this. "Vance, James, stand easy," he barked, his voice tight. He was worried this was some kind of mass hysteria, a prelude to a riot. But there was no anger in them. It was the opposite. It was a total collapse. It was grief. "Sarge, what do we do?" I called out, my voice sounding strange in the room filled with weeping. Willis stared for a long moment, his face a mask of confusion. "Just hold the line. Don't move on him. Just watch him." One of the prisoners, the older sergeant who had given the order to eat, was also crying. But he was looking at us. He was looking at me, at James, at Preacher. He was trying to say something, but he was choked with emotion. "I don't get it," I muttered. "I just don't get it. It's food. We eat it every day. It ain't that good." "That ain't why they're crying, Eli," Preacher said, his voice soft. He was always the one who saw things others missed. "It ain't about the taste." The older prisoner finally found his voice. He was still crying, but he pushed himself to his feet, his hands held out, palms up, showing they were empty. He bowed low, his forehead almost touching his knees. Then he stood up and spoke, the words desperate, guttural, pleading. He was pointing at the hamburger, then at us, then at his own men. "I don't know what he's saying, Sarge," James yelled. "I can see that, Private," Willis snapped. He motioned to one of the white guards at the door. "Go get Lieutenant Tanaka. Now." Lieutenant Tanaka was a Nisei, a second-generation Japanese American. His parents were probably in an internment camp in California while he was here, wearing a U.S. officer's uniform, translating for the men who had bombed his ancestral homeland. The ironies in this place just never let up. Tanaka walked in a few minutes later, his face crisp and professional. He took in the scene, the weeping men, the half-eaten burgers, us black guards standing there with our rifles, and his expression didn't flicker. He was a man used to living in a world that didn't make sense. Willis pointed to the older sergeant, who had started speaking again, the words tumbling out. Tanaka, find out what in the Sam Hill is going on. Are they sick? Is this a protest? Tanaka listened, his head cocked. He spoke back to the man in sharp, fluent Japanese. The man replied, his voice breaking. He pointed at the Coca-Cola bottle. He pointed at the beef patty. He held up his hands, which were trembling. After a long, tense minute, Tanaka turned back to Sergeant Willis. His own face was pale. "Well, Lieutenant?" Willis demanded. Tanaka took a deep breath. He says they were told, Sergeant, that if they were captured by the Americans, they would be tortured. Yeah, we know the propaganda," James muttered. "No, Private, you don't," Tanaka said, his voice sharp. "They were told they would be skinned alive, that their tongues would be cut out, that they would be starved and left for the buzzards. They were specifically told," he glanced at me and James, "that the black soldiers were savages from the jungle, cannibals who were brought here to butcher them personally." The mess hall went dead silent, except for the sound of the sobs. I felt a chill go right through me. Cannibals. They thought we were going to eat them. Tanaka continued, his voice low. "They haven't eaten in 2 days because they believed the food we gave them was poisoned. They thought this meal was the final cruel joke, that it was poisoned to make them die in agony." He pointed at the man who had cried first. He told them, "If we must die, let us die as soldiers. Eat. Show them no fear." My stomach turned. I looked at the young prisoner. He had taken that first bite believing it was his last. "So why are they crying, Lieutenant?" Preacher asked, his voice barely a whisper. Tanaka looked at the half-eaten burger on the table. "Because it's not poisoned." He let that hang in the air. He says, Tanaka paused, clearly struggling to translate the sheer emotion. He says they have been fighting for an emperor who told them they were divine, and that Americans were devils. But the devils gave them this. He picked up a Coca-Cola bottle. This is luxury, it's sweet. The meat, it's hot." He says, "No one gives a hot meal to an animal they are about to slaughter." He says, "We have been lied to. They are not crying because they are sad. They are crying because they are confused. They are crying because this hamburger, this single meal, has just destroyed their entire world. It's the first human thing that has happened to them in years, and it was given to them by the very men they were told were monsters." I looked at the weeping men, at the beef, at the bottles of Coke, these symbols of America, these things that were supposed to represent freedom, a freedom I couldn't even get at a lunch counter back home. And here they were, breaking down the will of an enemy more effectively than a bayonet ever could. I looked at my own hands, dark skin against the wooden stock of my rifle. Cannibals. Savages. They had been told the same lies about me that white folks back home told. And in that moment, staring at an enemy soldier who was crying over a hamburger, I wasn't sure who I hated more, the Japanese for believing the lie, or my own command for proving it wrong, using me as the messenger. Lieutenant Tanaka finished speaking, and the silence he left behind was heavy, suffocating. It was filled with the sound of men trying to regain their composure, the scrape of a boot, the sniff of a man trying to hide his shame. The prisoners weren't just POWs anymore. They were just men, broken men, staring at the wreckage of their beliefs on a paper plate. Sergeant Willis, for the first time since I'd known him, looked lost. He was a man of action, of orders, of clear-cut rules. You stand here, you shoot there. This was something else. This was psychology. This was feelings. And the Army didn't issue him a field manual for that. He cleared his throat, his voice rough. "Lieutenant," he said, nodding to Tanaka, tell them to finish their meal. Tell them it's just dinner, and it ain't poisoned. It's just food." Tanaka nodded, turned, and relayed the message in Japanese. The words sounded soft, almost gentle. The older sergeant, the one who had spoken, bowed deeply to Tanaka, then to Willis, then to us, to me, James, and Preacher. It wasn't the bow of a subordinate, it was the bow of a man acknowledging something, a debt, an understanding. It made my skin crawl. I didn't want his gratitude, I didn't know what to do with it. The prisoners, slowly, hesitantly, picked up their burgers again. They ate, but it was different now. They ate slowly, almost reverently. They took small sips of the Coke, holding the bottles, feeling the cold glass, reading the label. They were like men discovering fire. They were committing it all to memory. "James, preacher," I whispered, my voice hoarse. "Keep your eyes on the door, I'll watch the line." "Watch 'em for what, Eli?" James muttered, his own hard-boiled Chicago attitude completely gone, replaced by a stunned, hollow look. "Watch 'em cry into their fries? Man, this is messed up." "Just do it," I said. I couldn't stop staring at the young private, the one who had cried first. He was eating his hamburger with a kind of desperate focus, as if it was the most important thing he had ever done. And maybe it was. Maybe everything he thought he knew about his emperor, his country, his enemies, had just evaporated, and this piece of beef was the only real thing he had left to hold on to. It was the why. That's what shook me. It wasn't just that they'd been lied to. Everyone gets lied to in a war. That's what war is. It's one big lie, told by old men, paid for by young ones. It was because the lie was so specific. Cannibals, savages. They'd been fed the exact same poison about me that I'd been fed my whole life. Back home in Mississippi, white folks looked at me with that same mix of fear and disgust, as if I was something not quite human, something that might be dangerous if you got too close. They didn't say cannibal, but it was there in their eyes. Animal, brute, savage. And here I was, thousands of miles from home, wearing the uniform of the very people who thought that about me, guarding other people who'd been told to think that about me. And what was my weapon? What was the tool the army gave me to break them? Not a bullet, not a bayonet, a hamburger, a bottle of Coca-Cola, the whitest, most all-American symbols you could find. Symbols of a country that wouldn't let me drink from its white water fountains or eat at its white lunch counters. The hypocrisy of it all, the sheer crushing weight of the irony, landed on me like a physical blow. It was suffocating. I was a prop. I wasn't a guard. I was a tool of psychological warfare. Captain Miller and the infinite wisdom of high command. They hadn't chosen us, my segregated unit, by accident. They wanted the prisoners to see us. They wanted to stage this little play. "Look, prisoners, even our savages are civilized, even our cannibals serve you a feast. See how benevolent we are? See how hopeless your cause is?" They were using my blackness as a weapon. They were using the prejudice against me to break the will of their enemy. I felt a sudden hot surge of rage. It was so intense it made my vision tunnel. I wasn't mad at the prisoners anymore. They were pawns, just like me. I was mad at Captain Miller, at the army, at the whole damn system that put me in this impossible position, forced to serve symbols of a freedom I didn't have to an enemy, who was only now realizing he was more human than he'd been told. Where was my hamburger? Where was my Coke? Served with a side of dignity? "Eli, man, you okay?" Preacher's voice cut through my thoughts. He was looking at me, his Bible-thumping calm finally rattled. "You look pale. Or, paler." I realized my hands were shaking. I was gripping my M1 rifle so hard my knuckles were white. "I'm fine, Preach, just thinking. Maybe think a little less," he said quietly. This is God's work, son, in a strange way. If thine enemy hunger, feed him." "Is that what we're doing, Preach?" I snapped, my voice low and venomous. "Or are we just showing him how shiny his chains are? And what about us? Who's feeding us?" Preacher's face hardened. He knew exactly what I meant. He was from Alabama. He'd seen the same trees I had, the ones with the strange fruit. He didn't have an answer. He just looked away, back at the prisoners. The meal ended. The prisoners were marched out. They were different men. The hard, defiant glaze in their eyes was gone. It was replaced by nothing. A void. A stunned, hollow emptiness. They moved like ghosts. They had been broken, not by force, but by simple, undeniable kindness. And I was the one who had delivered the blow. That night I couldn't sleep. The image of that first man crying, I couldn't get it out of my head. But why they cried shook me. It shook me because their tears weren't for their emperor, or their families, or their lost war. They were crying because their hatred had been proven wrong. And I lay there on my cot in that segregated barracks in that dusty camp, and I had to ask myself a question that terrified me. What happens if my hatred is wrong? I hated the white officers. I hated the system. I hated the men who made me a guard but not a citizen. My hatred was my armor. It was the only thing that made sense, the only thing that kept me sane in this upside-down world. But what if, one day, Captain Miller, or some cracker from my hometown, did something human? What if he offered me a hamburger, not as a prop but as a man? Would I break down? Would my whole world, the one I'd built on the foundation of that righteous anger, collapse just like theirs? I didn't have an answer, and that was what shook me. That was the fear, that a single simple act of kindness could be more devastating than a bullet, and I didn't know if I was strong enough to survive it. The next morning, the camp was different. The air itself felt different. The defiant, brittle anger from the new prisoners was gone, replaced by a stunned, mechanical obedience. They still hated us, I supposed, but the certainty of their hate had been broken. Their world had a crack in it. My squad felt it too. James wasn't cracking jokes, he just cleaned his rifle with a quiet, furious energy. Preacher sat on his bunk, his Bible open, but he wasn't reading. He was just staring at the page, his lips moving silently. We'd all been part of it. We'd all seen it, and none of us knew what to do with the feeling. I was on afternoon watch, guarding a work detail. The prisoners were digging an irrigation ditch under the relentless Arizona sun. It was brutal, back-breaking work, but they worked without complaint. They worked like ghosts. I saw the young private from the mess hall. He was thin, but he worked hard. He glanced up as I patrolled the line. Our eyes met. He didn't look away in fear or hatred. He just looked. Then he gave a short, almost imperceptible nod. Not a bow, not a sign of submission. It was a nod of acknowledgement. It was the nod of a man who sees another man. It made my skin crawl. I was his guard, his enemy. I wasn't his equal. I turned away, my heart hammering. That's when I heard the Jeep. Captain Miller pulled up in a cloud of red dust. He stepped out, his sunglasses hiding his eyes, a smug little smile on his thin lips. He was carrying a clipboard. "Afternoon, Vance," he said, not looking at me, but at the prisoners. "They look docile, productive. It's a miracle." I stood at attention, my rifle shouldered. "Sir, my report to high command was, shall we say, glowing," he continued, tapping his clipboard. "This integration experiment was a resounding success. They're talking about rolling it out at other camps, imagine that. All because we gave them a taste of home." I stayed silent. My jaw was clenched so tight my teeth ached. My home? This wasn't my home. "It's amazing what a little American generosity can do," he mused, almost to himself. "You show them what they're missing. It just takes the fight right out of them, like feeding a stray dog. Once it knows you've got the good food, it stops biting." That was it. The word. Dog. "Is that what they are, sir?" I said. My voice was quiet. Dangerously quiet. Miller's smile faltered. He turned to me, his eyes now visible over the rim of his glasses. "What's that, Private?" "The prisoners, sir," I said, my blood running hot and cold. "Are they stray dogs? Or is that what we are?" The air went still. The only sound was the thunk of shovels in the hard dirt. Miller took a slow step toward me. His smile was gone. "You're walking a fine line, Vance. A mighty fine line. I just need to understand, sir. For my own clarity," I said, the words tumbling out before I could stop them. "Why us? Why my squad? You wanted them to see us, didn't you? You knew what their propaganda told them. You knew they'd be terrified of the black cannibals. You wanted them scared. You're on duty, Private. You follow orders," he said, his voice flat. "And then you had us feed them," I pushed, my voice shaking with a rage I hadn't even realized was there. "You had the savages serve them Coca-Cola. You used us. You used what they think of us, what you think of us, as a weapon. You used one dog to tame another." Miller's face went from pale to a deep, blotchy red. "You are so far out of line, Private. You can't even see the line anymore." He stepped right up to me, his face inches from mine. I could smell the tobacco on his breath. "You are a cog, Vance, a tool in a machine. I don't care if you're black, white, or polka-dotted. I tell you to turn, you turn. You don't ask why. You think you're so damn smart, don't you? Think you're the first boy to figure out war ain't fair?" "I figured out I was a prop, sir," I whispered. "And I don't know who you were aiming me at, them or me." The slap was so fast I didn't see it coming. His open palm cracked across my cheek, my head snapping to the side. The sound was sharp like a rifle shot in the hot, dead air. My cheek stung a white-hot fire. The entire work detail had stopped. The prisoners, the guards, James, Preacher, everyone was staring. Miller's voice was a low, vicious hiss. "You never speak to me like that again. You are a field hand from Mississippi that the Army was gracious enough to let wear a uniform. You are nothing. You're on latrine duty, indefinitely. One more word, one more look, and I will have you in the stockade for striking an officer. I'll say you swung first. Now who in the hell do you think they're gonna believe?" I turned my head back, my cheeks screaming, and looked him dead in the eye. I didn't say a word. I didn't say, "Yes, sir." I just stared. I let him see the hatred. I let him see he was right. He held my gaze for a long, burning second, and then, seeing he wouldn't get the "yes, sir," he snorted in disgust. "Clean the filth, Vance. It's what your kind is good at." He turned, got in his Jeep, and drove away. I stood there, the silence of the desert pressing in. My cheek was on fire, but my heart was cold. The terrifying question from last night, what if he'd been kind? It was gone. I was safe. My hatred was right. He was exactly the man I thought he was. I had my armor back. I started to walk toward the latrines, my rifle heavy in my hands. As I passed the line of prisoners, I saw the young private. He was watching me. His eyes weren't on my rifle. They were on the bright red handprint on my cheek. He looked at me, then at the dust cloud from Miller's Jeep, then back to me, and he nodded. That same, small, terrible nod. But this time, it wasn't acknowledgement. It was understanding. He'd seen the whole thing. He'd seen the savage guard get put back in his place by the real master. And in that one awful, silent look, the world shifted. We weren't guard and prisoner. We weren't American and Japanese. We were just two men, standing on the same patch of dirt, staring up at the bottom of the same boot. And that was the moment that truly, finally, shook me. My world shrank to the size of a latrine bucket. For the next week, I was on permanent sanitation duty. I scrubbed floors. I shoveled filth. I cleaned the messes of the white officers who wouldn't look me in the eye, and I cleaned the messes of the prisoners who now wouldn't stop looking at me. My cheek healed, the red mark fading to a dull purple bruise. But the humiliation was a fresh wound, opened up every morning by Captain Miller's smug inspections. He'd walk by, tap his boot on a spot I'd missed, and say, "Do it again, Vance. Get it clean." My squad was furious but helpless. "Man, you gotta keep your head down," James warned me, slipping me a cigarette behind the barracks. "He's trying to break you, Eli. He wants you to swing at him. Don't give him the satisfaction." "What satisfaction is left?" I muttered, taking a drag. "He already won." "No, he ain't," Preacher said, joining us. "He just showed his true colors. The Lord sees. The Lord ain't on this duty roster, Preach. I am." But the worst part wasn't Miller. It was them. The prisoners. They saw it all. They saw me hauling trash. They saw Miller yell at me, calling me boy in front of them. They saw me, the savage, the cannibal, being treated exactly like Miller had called them, a stray dog. And they watched. That young private, the one who cried first, I'd catch his eye from across the compound. He'd be digging that ditch and I'd be hauling a slop bucket, and our eyes would meet. That understanding, that look he'd given me, it was still there. It felt like a hot poker in my gut. I hated it. It felt like pity, and I didn't want his pity. I was his guard. I was the one with the gun. But we both knew, in that silent, dusty space between us, that it was a lie. The climax of my shame came a few nights later. I was on the worst guard shift, midnight to 4 a.m., patrolling the outer fence of the prisoners' barracks. It was a lonely, cold post. I was exhausted, my shoulders aching, my spirit rubbed raw. I leaned against a telephone pole in the shadows, just trying to stay awake. "Guard-san." The voice was a whisper, right in front of me. I snapped my M1 up, my heart leaping into my throat. "Halt! Who's there? Get back!" It was him, the young private. He was standing 10 feet away on his side of the barbed wire fence. He shouldn't have been out of his barracks. It was an executable offense. I said, "Get back," I hissed, my rifle pointed at his chest. "Get back or I'll shoot. Modor." He didn't move. He just stood there, a thin silhouette against the dim barracks light. He held his hands up, empty. "Please," he said in broken, terrible English. No shoot." "You got 3 seconds to be gone," I said, my thumb on the safety. I was angry, but I was also terrified. If Miller caught me talking to a prisoner, he didn't move. Instead, he He slowly, deliberately, pointed a finger. Not at my gun, at my cheek, the one Miller had hit. Him, the prisoner said, his voice rough. Him, Warui. He made a fist. Bad. I just stared, my rifle still up. You don't know what you're talking about. Get back. Then he did something that froze my blood. He pointed at his own cheek. Then he pointed at his back and made a sharp slapping motion against his own body. He was mimicking a beating. He was talking about his officers, the ones who had told him I was the devil. He looked at me, right through the fence, right through the uniform. His eyes were clear and there was no pity in them. There was just a terrible shared knowledge. He tapped his own chest. Watashi. Then he pointed through the fence, at my chest. Anada. Then he brought his two index fingers together, holding them side by side in the dim light. Onaji. He held the gesture for 1 second. Then he bowed, low and fast, and vanished into the shadows between the barracks before I could even find my voice to yell. I stood there for a long time, the rifle heavy in my hands. The word echoed in the silence. Onaji. I knew I had to know. The next day I found Lieutenant Tanaka near the administrative building. I stood at attention. Lieutenant. Permission to ask a question, sir. He looked at me, surprised. What is it, Vance? It's a Japanese word, sir. I need to know what it means. I'm listening. What does onaji mean? Tanaka's professional mask slipped. He frowned, looking at me with genuine curiosity. That's an odd question. It's a simple word. It means the same. Identical. Equal. Why do you ask? I felt the blood drain from my face. The same. No reason, sir. Just heard the prisoner say it. I gave him a salute and walked away before he could ask any more questions. The same. That was it. That was the why. The why they cried over a hamburger shook me because it showed me how kindness could destroy a man's world. But this shook me more. The prisoner wasn't crying because we were human. He was crying because he'd been lied to. And that night, at the fence, he had looked at me, at the red mark on my cheek, at the boot on my neck, and he'd realized that I had been lied to too. He saw my pain and he called it by its name. The same. The hamburger had shown him that I wasn't a monster. But the slap had shown me that he wasn't one either. He was just another man on the wrong side of a fence, and in the end, we were both prisoners in that camp. I finished my tour at Camp Shelby. The war in the Pacific ended a year later, after we dropped a son on their homeland. The prisoners went home, or what was left of it. I went home to Mississippi, but I was a different man. I was quieter. I'd gone to war to fight an enemy, and instead I'd found a mirror. I never saw Captain Miller again, and I never told anyone about that night at the fence. It was a secret between me and a man whose name I never even knew. I'm an old man now. I've seen the world change. I've seen whites-only signs come down. I've eaten at any lunch counter I damn well pleased. But I've never had a hamburger or a Coke that tasted simple. Everyone is complicated. Everyone is a reminder. War is supposed to be about difference, about us versus them. But the moment that shook me, the one that still shakes me, wasn't the moment I saw our differences. It was the moment I saw clear as day that we were onaji, the same. The hamburger didn't just break their propaganda, it broke mine. And in that mess hall and later at that fence, I realized the war wasn't about who was right or who was wrong, who was a devil and who was a man. It was just about who was holding the gun and who was behind the wire, and how fast that can change.